before I forget. And then I'm going to go ahead and just do our land acknowledgement, and then I'll hand it over to Alistair. So we would like to open the convening by recognizing that we are on the unceded ancestral land of the Coast Salish peoples, the traditional home of the tribes and the bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We cannot work to fulfill our mission and our vision of an anti-racist present if we don't first acknowledge and recognize the true history and cost of colonization. So with that acknowledgement, I will go ahead and turn it over to Alistair.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bambi. Hi, everybody. Great to see everybody. I am going to hopefully share my screen. Okay, you got me there? Yes, so audit findings. Sorry, it's been a long time getting to this point. Report itself is still in draft, but we're getting close. The goal today really to just kind of high level summary of the big chunk findings and really to feed the conversation as far as the review of the recommendations and thinking about anything else that maybe we should be thinking about. So I'm going to jump right in, try and move through these fairly quickly. Just a quick reminder of kind of the pathway here. We took a snapshot of affordable housing properties in Seattle. Really wanted to try and break down into three groups: all electric buildings, buildings that had gas for domestic hot water, and buildings that had gas for both domestic hot water and heat. Couple of things to point out here. The 32 EUI was a threshold we were looking at because that was at that time the state clean buildings target for multifamily buildings. We also drew a bead on an EUI of 38 for gas buildings on the basis that we figured that by switching out from gas domestic hot water to electric domestic hot water, that we could move the needle by at least 6 EUI points to get down to this 3 EUI target of 32. Of course, subsequent to all of that, the city's building performance standard has rightly focused on carbon emissions rather than EUI. And so that kind of changed the game a little bit, but that was sort of where we came from. And by the time that change happened, we'd already got in pretty deep into characterizing and selecting buildings. So we had a group of 15 buildings initially, narrowed down to the 13 that you see here, which we actually targeted for audit. And yeah, fairly good mix in terms of ages, sizes. You'll see quite a lot of consistency in terms of the unit areas, with a couple of exceptions, which I think are worth pointing out. The Frederick Ozanam building, noticeably smaller unit per square feet per unit. And I should note, this is the conditioned floor area of the residential building divided by the number of units. It's not the average area of just the residential units themselves, so a slightly different number. Also Patrick Place, which is another Catholic Communities project, lower than average. And then Bellevue Olive, significantly higher than the average. And again, this is square foot per unit, not per bedroom. And you'll see there's quite a bit of difference in terms of the bedroom counts, the bedroom to unit counts. So that was the original plan. Unfortunately, we were never able to engage effectively with Catholic Communities Housing during the window of opportunity. They came back to us ultimately a little after we'd finished the kind of field phase of the work. So unfortunately, we never actually got into those two buildings, but they are included because at least some of the background research and the benchmarking information and the analysis that came out of that benchmark data is all included in the report, even though we don't have physical on the ground audit results. Just a couple of things to call out here. We're using the OSE benchmark data primarily. There's some background information that's at the report level of the audits that also comes from the Office of Housing data. So we did combine those two data sets in order to get as complete information as possible and try and resolve and identify any conflicts where we could. For the most part, the numbers you're seeing today are based on the 2020 benchmark data. And it is the weather normalized data rather than the actual year. So a little bit of difference. I will say there are some slight inconsistencies in the data. And so the numbers that you see here might differ slightly from what you might see in the benchmark information that you look at it. But those things will be explained in a little more detail in the report. We've standardized everything to kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent as the sort of base metric. This information comes in all kinds of different forms. Pounds of carbon per megawatt hour, pounds of carbon per mega BTU, lots of different numbers. We're trying to be consistent here with kilograms of CO2e because that's the metric again that the BPS is likely to be using. We'll talk about a term called electrical headspace. I'm not sure if we've coined this. I think it's in colloquial usage among those who know. Basically, what we're talking about there is how much gap is there between the peak electric load in the building and the capacity at the transformer, whether that's in the street or in the building, to the extent that we have that information. And this is a really critical piece of information to understand when we start talking about electrification. And we'll touch a little bit more on that. And as I've already mentioned, the square foot per unit metric that we're using is not the average size of a residential unit. Rather, it is the total conditioned floor area divided by the number of units. So it does actually include common area and corridors and so on in that metric. Okay, so just to give you a quick kind of summary, as I say, we started off looking at EUI and sort of just to slice this a couple of ways of the 13 buildings. What you'll see here is a summary of the EUIs. And so if we look at that 32 number, you can see that pretty much everybody, with the exception of Ernestine Anderson, who I think is actually right at 32, everybody is above that state metric. So that's point number one. The one thing that I would call out here, and here, one of the things that we'll carry forward into the recommendations conversation is if you look at the EUI based on a per bedroom count, you'll see that for the most part, we get pretty consistent information because for the most part, the buildings are pretty similar. The one exception is Frederick Ozanam, which, as I pointed out before, has a high density count. Instead of 650 square feet, roughly, as the sort of average bedroom size. Frederick Ozanam is at about 400, I believe. And so significant difference there from a relatively high performance on the EUI per square foot basis to being right in the running with the rest of the crowd. So I think that, an important observation, something that I think the city is already looking at and is aware of, but once again, kind of reinforcing the fact that we got some differences here. The other thing I will call out is that Bellevue and Olive is a good performer in both categories. This was the one that had the larger bedrooms. We're not entirely convinced that the benchmark data is accurate. The numbers just seem a little out of whack, suggesting that there's a meter missing somewhere, but we've not been able to find the source of the issue there. And it may just be the unique characteristics of the building calling this, but once again, just to kind of call that out as a factor. So then if we look at emissions intensity, so now we're looking at the BPS metric. kilograms of CO2e per square foot, we start to get a different picture. Obviously here, the all electric buildings on the left, the first group, I'm sorry, I should have called that out. The first group of buildings is all electric. The second group of buildings has gas for domestic hot water, but electric for everything else. And the third group of buildings has gas for domestic hot water and space heat, and electric for everything else. And some of these buildings, including Bellevue and Olive, have electric in-unit heat. The other three actually have gas for both in-unit heat and common area and corridor heat. So that's why you see a sort of noticeable difference there. Once again, you know, probably the standout difference is that in the emissions area, we still see this anomaly resulting from the different occupancy density in Frederick, Ozanam. But otherwise, fairly kind of consistent patterns between the two. So I want to go on look at these sort of things, these numbers in a little more detail.
Quick question.
Yes.
For the previous two slides, going back to understand Anderson in the EUI slide prior,
Okay.
because I hadn't realized it was all electric. No, it's the Frederick one where you say the EUI remains higher for that building.
Yeah.
Relative to others. Is that really driven by the age of the building? What are some of the driving factors for some?
Well, the point here is particularly that the high EUI is because of the occupant density. So when you have small units, you have more people consuming energy per square foot. And so this is the kind of challenge of the basic EUI metric and the basic emissions per square foot metric, is that with affordable housing, we tend to have higher than average occupancy density because we have smaller units and more people in those units. And so that tends to lead to higher energy consumption on a square foot basis. So it kind of penalizes, it places affordable housing at a disadvantage compared to market rate particularly. So it's probably relevant to think of that in the bigger context. So not just in the context of the 13 buildings we're looking at here, but in the bigger context, if the average unit size here is 650 square feet, and in market rate, it might be higher than that, you know, that also places a higher burden on affordable housing with that higher density than it does on market rate. And so that's one of the things that I think is a key consideration. And it holds true in the emissions intensity figure as well. The big difference here, of course, is that because all these 5 buildings are consuming Seattle City Light electricity, and only that electricity, their emissions are very low. And so against the emissions targets, as an all electric building, you're in good shape. The difference then comes as we start seeing fossil fuel in the building, that then the emissions start to go up significantly, and that's where we have a difference. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Great, awesome. So coming on to the all electric buildings, just to kind of bring this into focus, the bars here I've placed are sort of arbitrary at this point, but I think a reasonable assessment, the EUI is at 32, which is the target for the state clean building standard for multifamily buildings. The bar that I've placed on the emissions is at 0.22, which may be the sort of order of magnitude we might see from the BPS perhaps. And so I think, you know, the thing that obviously jumps out is, number one, if you're all electric, you're actually looking pretty good. For the most part, all these buildings in fairly good shape. Again, the one significant exception being the Frederick Ozanam building, because of this density anomaly. And I think this is kind of key. So we'll come on to talk about it a bit more further on. But
May I
even
ask a very dumb question? If
there
you're an
are no
all
dumb
electric,
questions.
I think I know the answer to this, but if you're an all electric building, what are your options for reducing your emissions? I mean, is that really just to increase energy efficiency? I mean, what can maybe if this is better addressed later on, that's fine, but I'd love to better understand that.
It's a great question, and I think it's a key one, but I am going to come on to it further on. So
Okay.
if you'll hold it,
Yep,
we'll
happy to
come
do
back
that.
to it. Yep. So the points up at the top here, obviously in this case, the retrofit potential is something we'll come on to talk a little more about. But the reality is that the headspace question, do we have enough electric capacity, is not a problem because we're only going to be reducing the electric capacity. So headspace is not an issue from that point of view. I do think the thing to be aware of is
What is headspace also? Sorry,
headspace is how much extra capacity you have in your electrical service between how much, how big the pipe is and how much electricity you're using from that pipe on a peak basis.
Alistair, is that the electrical capacity available in the building with the panel, or is that the electrical capacity to the building from the utility?
Good question.
That was my question as well. Yep.
Yeah. So and they are different. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but I think the two levels of priority are: one, what's available in the building, and two, what's available at the transformer. And is the transformer in the building or is the transformer in the right of way? All of those things are relevant and become much more relevant when we get into the buildings that are currently using fossil fuels and looking to retrofit. So we'll circle back to that as well. I think the key to be aware of here is that the state timeline is looking at a 2026 startup, primarily looking at planning and benchmarking and so on at this stage. But obviously in the sort of legislative process and in the rulemaking, there is this possibility of either incentives available or eventually some kind of regulation of this EUI target. So this is something to be aware of for all electric buildings, is that their EUI may become a relevant factor down the road. So if we come on to look at the buildings with gas for domestic hot water, obviously we see a very different picture. Emissions intensity increasing dramatically due to the amount of fossil fuel being used in the building. The EUIs not so different between electric and gas. So while we do have an issue here, it's not a lot different from the other circumstance, but here the focus very much comes on to the building performance standard within the city of Seattle, because if the target ends up in this range, then obviously these buildings have some work to do. And this is where we had this assumption that if we had a small gap, we could fix that by retrofitting with heat pump water heaters. So we did a prototype analysis, made a set of assumptions for how these buildings were. We basically took the full gas consumption from these buildings, made a base assumption for this graph that was an 80% central gas system, and that we were going to switch it out for a central heat pump water heater system with a COP of 2.5. And the result of that is what we're seeing here. Obviously, very significant drop from the original actual intensity to what we're seeing here. And Jen, looks like you have another question. You're on mute, sorry.
Okay, sorry. I'm curious, very curious what's included in the cost, but no rush to get to that.
Yes, okay. Yeah, and again, so this number, might as well talk about it now because it's going to come up again. The reality is here that numbers are all over the map for cost right now. This number is pretty consistent with both what City Light found in their cost analysis done early in the year, and also updated with what we've seen and what Ecotope has seen from actual installation. It's a really hard number to draw a bead on. This is installed cost. So this is both equipment and labor to remove and replace equipment. It doesn't include any change to electrical service.
Okay,
so it assumes, so it assumes that we have the headspace. The good news is that from what we've seen between what's available and what the peak consumption is in these buildings, most of them have comfortable headspace to be able to do this retrofit. That's because some of them actually may have gone from electric to gas at some point in the not too far distant past. In other cases, it's to do with the amount of capacity that was installed at the time the building was designed and constructed versus how much has been reduced due to other efficiency measures over time. So we're seeing some changes from that point of view. The other number that we took here, and again, this is a kind of gross generalization at this point, is that if you spread that retrofit cost over 20 years, you're looking at between $140 and $200 a ton of avoided CO2, right? Everybody kind of understand what that metric means? So
is that a simple payback, or is that a net present value?
No, it's a simple calculation at this point. The numbers are also rough here, and as I say, we kind of dig into more specific detail on a building by building basis, but at this level it's fairly generalized, but I think it's a useful number to be thinking about, and we'll come on to talk about that a little bit later on as well.
And is the 2,500 number per unit the lowest end of the spectrum of cost?
It's not the lowest end. It's probably 2,000 to 2,500 at the moment, but I would say that has dropped significantly over the last 2 or 3 years. The market is transitioning very quickly, and we saw this with the exemplary building program, having started with a focus on introducing this new idea of central heat pump water heaters to the marketplace, to a very rapid transition in terms of people developing capacity in the market for delivery, the quality of tools for sizing equipment, for designing systems, for controlling systems. All of that information is rapidly improving in the marketplace. So I think we're actually going to continue to see that price coming down. Equipment costs getting better, and so on. But of course, on the other hand, there is the more challenging question of what's the retrofit challenge. So the physical barriers associated with installing and replacing systems, space, storage capacity, and so on are all things that are pretty unknown. So while I do think that one half of the formula is changing, obviously there's a hard physical cost that's in there as well that is unlikely to shift significantly.
I just want to underscore that what Alistair's saying there, that the commercial heat pump water heater costs we're still on the left tail of the hockey stick here. Installations are going to be increasing very quickly, and that will drive down the market cost. Yeah, thanks.
And one more clarifying question, Alistair, would the emissions change here? This is just with the central heat pump and no additional.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and this was a sort of simplistic exercise. One of the things that is in discussion as far as the city's rulemaking is concerned is, the possibility of an alternate compliance path for affordable housing where you just do a heat pump water heat retrofit and consider your job done. And I think the data here from the audits and this analysis suggests that, that's probably not a bad approach to be looking at. If I can just step on to the EUI impact, based on this, again, we're seeing buildings coming down much closer to the state threshold, not necessarily quite there, but definitely in the right realm. But on this analysis, we saw a slightly more significant shift than we had anticipated. I do want to just point out, actually going back, again, our base assumption here is that this was an 80% efficient gas system. Several of these projects have systems that are higher efficiency than that, 90%, 95%, at least nominally in the equipment. And so in that case, your savings would be reduced, because with the more efficient use of the gas, your actual gas consumption is smaller in relation to the amount of heat that's delivered. So when you switch that over to the heat pump, you don't get such a big gain. So looking on an individual basis, the picture's probably not quite as pretty as this. If you've got a system that was updated in the last 10 or 12 years or so, maybe, so you're probably looking at a higher efficiency system. So again, something to be thinking about as far as the bigger picture from a strategic program perspective. So then gas for space and water heat.
Alistair,
Yes.
I'm sorry, go back one chart. I didn't. So what, oh, this is EUI versus emissions from the previous chart. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this is the emissions picture. This is the EUI picture.
Thank you.
So if we're looking at domestic hot water and space heat, again, increased overall emissions just because of the amount of the building load that is on fossil fuel. And then from the EUI perspective, a more mixed bag in this case. Canada House is a DESC building, so it's permanent supportive housing. It's got pretty high occupant density. It's got very high use, very high ventilation, and an associated conditioning load with that. A lot of hot water use, so there's a lot going on in that building. And anecdotally, we're also conscious that they don't necessarily feel they have good control of the systems in that building, and there's probably quite a lot of opportunity for efficiency, just squeezing better performance out of the system by getting it under control. So it is a bit of an outlier from that point of view. And again, Bellevue and Olive, electric heat in the units. So we're only looking at the corridors. I think heat pumps even in the common areas in Bellevue and Olive. So this quite a different building from a characteristic point of view. These three buildings are all hydronic heat, and the opportunity there is that potentially fairly straightforward to switch out to heat pumps with some caveats that we'll talk about. So if we take the first step and just retrofit domestic hot water in those buildings using the same set of assumptions, we see a modest improvement, but not sufficient, with the exception of Bellevue and Olive, because the bulk of their gas is still domestic hot water. But with the rest of the buildings, modest but not sufficient to meet the goal. So the alternate compliance path of just retrofitting domestic hot water, not substantial enough to really have a significant impact. And coincidentally here, because, well, there's some complexity to why it is, but they cost per ton quite a bit higher for these particular retrofits on average than in the other cases, though I'm not sure that's actually a significant finding at this point. So then if you go the whole way, and here we're talking about switching out both the domestic hot water and the space heat boilers, converting them all over to heat pumps, and switching over gas heat in any other spaces over to air source heat pumps, then we see overall performance coming down to where we would want it. So, you know, the good news overall is that the likely emissions target is accessible, but the cost is going to be pretty significant, and the questions and so on associated with how we're actually going to get there is still fairly complicated.
Alice, can you explain this, the air source heat pump line there? Why that's per ton, not per unit?
Oh, yes. So just based on the data, and because the air source heat pump in this case is typically being applied to corridor conditioning and or common areas, we didn't do it on a per unit basis. So the numbers are surprisingly close. If you look at domestic hot water adjustment on a per ton basis, it's between $2,500 and $2,800 a ton. But for the air source heat pumps, because we weren't particularly looking at unit impact, the consumption per unit became less important. So I just used the per ton calculation.
You're saying $35,000 for the whole building to convert it to an air source heat pump?
Yeah, this is Bellevue and Olive particularly. So this is only converting the corridor system.
Ah, just Bellevue Olive. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Still looks very, very low, but okay. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yep. No problem. So that's kind of, where are we time-wise? I should wrap up. So just kind of all high-level assessment. The one thing I did want to call attention to, just having looked at this cost per ton number, is comparing it to this. So this is the social cost of carbon. So this is the number that we've been talking about in terms of what's the cost of each ton. These are the state numbers. And so what we're looking at as this quantification of what the impact of a ton of carbon is. We are currently here, 2020, 2025, at about $79 a ton to $87 a ton. So I think one of the things that certainly has struck me, and you'll know I've talked quite a bit about this net present value of a ton of removed carbon, and Seth raised the point as well. I think this is really key in terms of thinking how we navigate these issues, that obviously there's a clear difference between the cost of an avoided ton in the examples that I've given, somewhere between $140 and $200 typically, and this social cost of carbon. And I'm not drawing any conclusions or making any assumptions about it, as much as just at this point drawing attention to it, and to the fact that obviously it escalates over time, and at the same time we're seeing these retrofits cost likely to be coming down over time. So I think that's a factor that is worth considering. Overall, just to sort of quickly put this in context as far as the building performance standard is concerned, I think the current proposal for affordable housing. Yes, Steve, sorry, go ahead.
I'm just backing up. So I didn't see the data for the all gas building, the gas heat, other than the Bellevue Olive.
Which, in terms of cost?
Yeah, so using a cost example, Bellevue Olive, which is the outlier of those four buildings, because it only has corridor. The others, which are hydronic, which could be, you know, in my experience, the absolute most costly, most difficult. So I'm wondering about that. And the other thing is, you mentioned headspace early on, but then with the buildings that are partial or all gas, you haven't mentioned headspace.
Yeah, well, and I'll come on to talk about that. The reason that I focused on Bellevue Olive is that at this point, that was the one that I had the best data on in terms of the system capacities. I'm still pulling information out of our audit team right now. And so there will be more specific data on all the buildings. I just used this one as an example for this morning. And as far as the headspace issue is concerned, I will come on to talk about that as a more kind of general issue.
And the 155K number, Alistair, is that per building?
That was for this building specifically.
Okay.
And again, in fairly simple terms, based on that $2,500 a unit average cost. None of these are based on actual work scope assessment, because we didn't have the scope to be able to get to that point. And
Just
probably,
oh, sorry,
Yep.
Alistair.
go ahead.
I want to say this because I mean, obviously here at the city, there's a lot of interest in cost, and I just want to make sure I'm clearly understanding what this says and doesn't say. This $155,000 is for the Bellevue Olive project, which just had gas heating for the corridors, not for the units. And I think, Steve, that's your question as well. What would these costs look like where there was also gas heating systems for in-unit heating? And that's what you're still working with to get that data from your audit team.
Yeah.
That would likely have a different cost estimate.
Yes, significantly.
Okay.
And
Okay.
so, yeah, because even, I mean, if you imagine, so if you take the $2,500 to $3,000 a ton that we're looking at for domestic hot water, then in a simplistic calculation, if you add in hydronic heat, obviously you're adding a huge amount of capacity just to meet the heating load. And that's going to come at that, $2,500 to $3,000 a ton. But then the other issue, and we'll come on to talk about this, is obviously whether the system has the capacity to be simply retrofit. Can you just take out the boiler and put in heat pump water heaters, or does the distribution and delivery also have to be upgraded? So there's a lot of assessment of the sizing of the radiators, the sizing of the distribution, the type of heat pump and the delivery temperature that it can provide. There are a lot of variables, and those we do discuss on a building by building basis, but it didn't seem like there was time to kind of dig into those details here.
Patience or Bambi, you might be able to better answer this, but is there going to be a report that becomes available with some of that more detailed information, or how will the information be provided?
It is our goal to have a report of the audit analysis.
With some project specific information as well, because I do think that'll be helpful.
Yes, yeah, and actually I have a slide at the end that talks about that, but yes, the report will have individual building information, both in terms of the characterization and the specifics of the building, and some analysis of the costs and impacts individually, again, based on this kind of rough order of magnitude pricing rather than a specific analysis. The only way to really get a good number is to get in and have the professionals actually cost out the equipment. So I just wanted to do a quick touch base on the timing. I think everybody's probably aware of this already. The program likely comes into force in 2026, but for affordable housing, really the 2031 is the first cycle where things will really start to become more focused. 2036 is when you actually have to meet the emissions target. So we're still a long way out, but clearly in order to get to that point, planning and taking action sooner rather than later is critical. Obviously thinking about financing cycles asset management cycles and planning and so on. So definitely needing to act sooner rather than later, and assuming that depending on how the funding works out for this, potentially good value in being an early mover rather than a late mover from that point of view. So considerations as far as the all electric buildings are concerned, as I say, overall, what we're seeing is that from an emissions point of view, the electric buildings are likely to be in good shape as far as the building performance standard is concerned, but the EUI target for the state is going to be the one to watch. They're talking about load reduction. So Jennifer, back to your point, obviously the opportunities for an all electric building are really focused around load reduction, and where they haven't already happened, window upgrades, one of the big opportunities. There are still some other efficiency measures on the table. I think there are some buildings that still have some opportunity for retrofits of other equipment, but window upgrades is definitely one of the significant ones. Ventilation options, depending on the
You
ventilation
had a really good
system.
question. Oh, can I just go back? Steve had a really good question, which is I should have asked too. Why do these all electric buildings have emissions?
because the city light is not emissions free, and the calculation is based on what city light does to offset the non-renewable electricity that they buy in off the grid.
But I think in the proposed ordinance, electric buildings will be exempt from the emissions requirements from the city perspective. Still may fall under the state requirements for EUI.
Yeah, so ultimately, I mean, obviously, if we go back here, ultimately we're all aiming to get to zero, and the way to get to zero is to have zero emissions electricity being the only energy consumed in the building. But at the moment, city light is not a zero emissions utility. They offset some emissions. Yeah, so back to Jennifer's point, the load reduction, there are definitely opportunities. Depending on how ventilation is set up in the units, there may be some opportunity to improve the ventilation performance by adding ERVs. It depends what the infrastructure in the building is. Corridor ventilation, I think there is some opportunity here. We find that most buildings, their corridors are over ventilated. They're using 100% outside air, and there are opportunities to improve energy performance there. And then obviously, even for an electric building, if they have central all electric domestic water heating, there's the opportunity to maybe do a heat pump retrofit on the central system. In very odd occasions, there might be the opportunity to look at heat pump retrofits in unit tanks, though that's a pretty odd set of circumstances where I think that's feasible at present, though there may be some technology solutions.
The two other options in corridors is just turn the heat off in the corridor, which has been successful, or replace it with heat recovery ventilation, which is a middle ground. Both have been successful.
Yeah, and again, we've got
seems doable.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a line to walk in terms of thermal comfort, how you meet those loads, who's meeting them. If you turn the heat off in the corridor, what does that mean for somebody's paying for the heat for that space? Yeah, but yes, all of those are options. As far as the gas hot water situation, this is the headspace conversation primarily. Do you have the capacity? And I think here the first step is to check with Seattle City Light. We got some data from City Light in terms of what the capacity at the transformer is. And again, if the transformer's in the building, that is a benefit. If it's out in the street, what does that actually mean? Versus what the peak load is. So there's a little data that's generally fairly easily available. And then if it's unclear from that, then the next step is to do a more detailed load analysis, looking at the panel layout and panel capacity. And that gets pretty complex. So a pretty significant engagement with an electrical engineer to do a load analysis. Will have some costs in the report for what a typical analysis would look like and would cost. Once again, if you don't have enough headspace, what are the options short of increasing capacity? And if there's a limit at the transformer, that obviously becomes a huge expense very quickly. But is it possible to look at load reduction to get load off the system elsewhere and to shift the load? So both reducing load by switching out appliances. There's one project that we were looking at that created a significant amount of capacity because they decided to switch out their electric ranges in all the units and get rid of the oven altogether, which led to a significant decrease. Windows, the same load reduction measures we've talked about. Other things maybe to think about are solar thermal. We've turned our back on solar thermal for hot water because the PV and heat pump pathway has seemed much more reliable and predictable and manageable. But in this case, it's a much higher efficiency system than PV. And it may be that there's some warrant to actually looking at whether solar thermal might offer a pathway that's significantly more cost effective than having to upgrade the electric system. And then also looking at controls and storage. One of the things that actually I think should be standard with all the gas hot water refits is looking at when the system runs and how much storage capacity you have so that you can avoid the peak loads. Obviously, the issue about headspace is all about when your peak load occurs. So if you can spread that load and keep some of the big loads off the peak, it may be possible to create some capacity. Yeah, we got a couple of hands. Jen, I see you, the hand up.
I've asked a bunch of questions, so I'm happy to let someone else go first.
Steve.
Except
No,
if it's
the other
Steve.
one.
I do need to run, everyone. I'll catch up on the recording later. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
This is a completely unfair question, but I'm curious, like, how likely do you think it is that reducing load through other measures would provide enough headspace? I mean, is that really going to be a feasible option for a lot of these buildings that are trying to make the conversion, or is that just to be determined? I mean, it sounds great, but I'm just curious if that's really going to be a feasible path in many cases.
Yeah.
Before I leave, I'll jump in. One of the things we've had, it depends where the headspace is.
Yeah.
So if you're saving in the units, that doesn't always provide headspace in the central panel,
Right.
and vice versa. So it's very tricky. Right, Marty?
I'll unmute long enough to say yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's where it does get into complexity and where this kind of detailed load analysis becomes much more important. And I mean, I think as a first step, very often just understanding the panel layout and what's going on and where the capacity is key. And again, we didn't get the opportunity to bring on an electrical engineer for this phase of the process, so haven't dug into that in a lot of detail.
You know, in terms of panel capacity, we'll have some more information about the potential for commercial heat pump water heaters to shift the DHW load for central installations with the baby study that'll be available for the next, 6 months or so. But with DHW being the highest single controlled source of load for multifamily, it's an important conversation to make component to this conversation, or is an important component of this larger conversation.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
And add some complexity potentially as well, thinking about space and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think it's definitely a significant one. Seth, do you, just on the solar thermal component, do you have any kind of reaction to that? Just quickly, it's something that's come up more just recently, and I haven't had a chance to kind of bounce it around a lot.
Not off the top of my head, no, I don't.
Yeah.
I think it's a great idea, but I think folks in the office have found that it doesn't always work as well as we think it does.
Yeah. Definitely some challenges.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, and so then the last slide, really all the same issues as far as the domestic hot water and space heat issue. And as I touched on, there are a lot of big questions when it comes to the hydronic heat question and what the potential for retrofit is. And so these ones in a magical world could be fairly straightforward, but in the real world likely are always going to be fairly complex and need a great deal of analysis and a great deal of planning. And then the other main points I'm making here, I think we've touched on already, where we've got particularly corridor heat and ventilation. You know, there's clearly opportunities depending on the infrastructure in the building. If there's only one shaft for outside air, it's pretty expensive to try and do anything with it except reduce it, stop heating it, as Steve suggested. Where there are two shafts in the building, then that does create the opportunity to start looking at a balanced system with some energy recovery. So a lot of kind of more detailed analysis to get to squeezing down all the components of the load in those situations. So what's in the report, I already kind of covered this, findings on the buildings in general, decision trees and the what if scenarios to help kind of plan those things out. More on cost data on the specific cases. The idea, one of the things that was clear is that we're not necessarily capturing all the right information. So a summary of what are the things you really need to be thinking about when you're doing a capital needs assessment. What do you need to add to that scope in order to get the information you need as part of your cycle? And then also just the building specific information, details of what we found in the buildings, all part of that report, and that will be available publicly. And I think I've touched on these in terms of feeding this conversation about recommendations. You know, there's alternate compliance, there's a DHW retrofit as a sort of standard one-stop opportunity, what the benefits and limitations of that are. Thinking about an adjustment for occupant density, I think is critical, because some buildings obviously are going to be burdened more than others from that point of view. The substantial alteration trigger is something that I think has come up in the discussions more recently, that this can be a real challenge if doing retrofits to meet the BPS is going to trigger a substantial alteration, which will then place these buildings under a need to comply with the new code across the board. That clearly can make things unfeasible, economically much more challenging. The capital needs assessment I've already talked about, and I think the other things I've really talked about as well. So that's it. Sorry, a little longer than we were scheduled for, but hopefully good discussion. So any other questions? You want to move on to a discussion, Bambi? Yes, Sandra.
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. This is great to see this finally coming together. It's really useful information. I have probably a couple of questions, but one of them I'm curious, and I'm not sure if this is feasible, but would PV be a means to reduce the headspace? Or are you still basically, because, you know, if you're net metered, I'm not sure if it makes a difference or not. So I'm curious if that would be a means to sort of provide allow headspace by
Yeah.
providing on-site
It-
renewables.
Not necessarily, because it's about timing, right?
Yeah,
So PV and batteries, maybe, but you're kind of
Mhm.
getting into a level of complexity that
mhm.
I'm not sure most affordable housing operators are ready for. Marty?
There we go. Yeah, the whole question around finding available headspace in an existing system is the one that we struggle with. And I mean, this is characteristic of multifamily, is controlling the resident behavior. And there's a tremendous amount of headspace available in what they do wrong. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, we look at, and I'll use our Meridian Manor property as an example. I'll go there in the middle of December, January, and windows are open in 2/3 of the units. Steve and I have talked about having window controls that when the windows are open, the heat turns off, just things like that. If we can find systems that control what residents do, that's going to make an enormous difference and free up a lot of headspace. Just a thought.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think that strategic energy management approach is something that likely has to be a part of this. Thinking about how you're able to engage with residents and manage their behavior, or either coach their behavior or actually control and manage it with physical systems. And the complexity of the technology that's becoming available to help with that, I think, is also improving pretty rapidly. And we're seeing more and more wireless systems that could be deployed that could really help with that. But again, not without cost and not without a human resource component to actually have to manage that, right? So yeah, but great point. Becky.
Yeah, I think to tag on to that, one of the thoughts, and I missed some of the beginning because of internet issues, so apologies if this is repetitive, but the buildings with the higher density, it's nice that you noted that. I think some of those buildings also have a permanent supportive housing population. And so whether it's permanent supportive housing or even seniors, do you think it might be important to note those buildings where the majority of residents are at home all day? Because that, to me, seems like also a factor why the baseline use is high. And then obviously that creates a lot of opportunity, but the headspace issue, I think, is complicated by the resident behavior piece, Marty, that you mentioned, especially if they're generally home all day.
Yeah, it's a great point, because obviously that changes the energy use profile where the peaks are as well. But yeah, I had mentioned, didn't actually draw attention to it, but understanding and noting occupancy is definitely a key component.
And I just know this is what DSC and Plymouth noodle on all day, and I'm sure SHA and Bellwether, everyone does, but I know DSC and Plymouth in particular. I mean, this is what they noodle on, and why they experimented with hydronic and all,
right.
all the different things. I think each building for them is a new effort to really try to accommodate the mental health challenges of residents who are at the building 24 hours.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also one of the sort of cautionary tales, I think, because clearly in an effort to try and chase those things down, the level of complexity that's been added into those buildings has proven to be a real challenge. And so I think there's definitely ground to be plowed there in terms of how we improve that, because DESC is a classic example of really focusing hard on trying to find better ways to manage those loads and those impacts, and struggling with the complexity of control systems that have resulted, and some pretty strong observations about the people selling and installing those control systems as well. Yeah, good points. Sandra, I think you first, and then Mark had
Yeah.
hands up.
So to the question, I'm curious if you all have a recommendation or will have a recommendation on what the metrics should be for multifamily housing that, you know, I mean, because I really appreciate, you know, this density issue. And we are looking with our, you know, analysis, you know, targets analysis consultant at what the metrics should be for multifamilies, because not on a square foot basis, but or normalized in some way for bedrooms. And then Becky, you're bringing up, it's not just like, you know, density of occupancy, it's sort of like the type of occupancy that you know, and hours changing as they might in a commercial building. So I'm curious, Alistair, is if you have recommendations and, you know, either now or would encourage you as you continue with this report to put some in, because that would be helpful for us to know.
Yeah, I think, you know, this sample on its own is too small, but it certainly has sort of, you know, drawn the spotlight to certain key characteristics. And I think we could go back into the data in a little more detail and probably come to some recommendations maybe about where those targets, you know, what are the driving characteristics and maybe where those targets might sit. Mark.
So two quick things. One for Alistair that I saw in chat. Do you have any idea when the report is likely to come out?
Yes, by the middle of October. Is we've had various issues going on internally, staffing wise. And the audit team just has not been in a position to really pull out and finalize their part of the process. We're getting through that, I think, this week, and so we should be able to finalize that. So a full draft probably next week, and then kind of polish it up and finalize it for the end of the second week in October.
Thanks. And the second thing is we have less than half an hour of what we've scheduled and wanted to see if the plan would be to adjust whether we go beyond the recommendations today or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure how people feel about that, but my assumption at this moment would be, you know, this is a preliminary and we're going to have a bigger report and be able to kind of think it through and analyze it a little bit more in terms of thinking about editing recommendations. So my feeling would be that we should go ahead and have Sandra present on the current draft for OSE. And that way we kind of come away with a lot of information, and we're in different stages of information. And then we might need to have an additional meeting in the future to be able to, you know, take that information, digest it a bit, and then be able to apply to how we would change recommendations. Yeah, but I'm open to another scenario if that seems different for others.
So if I could just, I actually have a couple more or sort of another question for Alistair. And so I wonder if we could, from my perspective, be useful to continue this vein for a little bit. And then I'm happy to either do a presentation or, you know, certainly HDC had sent the city some comments and we could talk specifically about those. And so I'll start with my question, which leads into those recommendations. And then, you know, we could spend the last 15 minutes and I could present what I have. A lot of you may have already seen it, but happy to do whatever works best for the group. So I was actually going to ask you to go back to a slide, Alistair, which is, and the basically the greenhouse gas emissions per, I guess, square foot, when you are removing the domestic hot water. And maybe what I'm trying to get at is understanding, you know, domestic hot water is often a big emissions load in multifamily building, and it's often the only load, right? If you've got electric resistance heat. And so the trying to think about, as we are setting the targets, setting them, both on a sort of linear path, but also what's achievable, right? And it seems like, one of the first or only big moves in multifamily is domestic hot water. And so if that in and of itself gets you to the emissions reduction, then, golden. And so that's interesting that this is not quite doing it. And these are, which is weird because they become all electric in this scenario, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so then
Yeah,
we can,
essentially, yeah.
yeah, so then that will work, but it's, what I'm not seeing is sort of, and we'd have to back this out maybe, but the reduction. So my question to the group is actually this question about a prescriptive option in lieu of a target. And so the question being, if, doing the work of, say, eliminating domestic hot water in a building gets you to the target, do you need a prescriptive option? Or is there a reason that it makes it simpler to just think about changing out the system instead of calculating the greenhouse gas intensity? I don't know if I'm quite making sense, but if you meet the target by doing this, do you need the prescriptive option?
I mean, maybe I'll start off with a perspective. I mean, I think that from a predictability point of view, the prescriptive option is infinitely preferable, right? I do this one thing, I know I'm good. If you're held to a target and you do the one big measure that you've got and you're still not there, then where do you go? So, to me, I think particularly for these buildings, it would seem that the prescriptive option is the best choice. Yeah.
Sandra, I just want to make sure I understand too, if I'm if these buildings were to convert to a hot water heat pump system, they would then be all electric and they would then be exempt, right? Is that the right logic? So maybe it's one and the same for any building that has one measure. It's really, it's sort of one and the same. It is prescriptive. You do this one thing, you're good because there's nothing else to do, right? I think it is more of a question for projects that might have multiple gas systems.
Yeah, I would say that's true. You're absolutely right. If you do this one thing and you become all electric, then you're all electric. But if you do this one thing, you still have gas corridor heating, or you do this one thing and you still have gas heating in the units, or gas cooking, which, did any of these have gas cooking, Alistair? You're muted.
Yeah, as soon as you said that, I thought, oh, and I haven't actually checked. So we did look, but I'm not sure. I don't believe any of them have gas, but I might be wrong. I'd be surprised.
I actually have a property that I'm trying to electrify right now, and that's kind of the odd element that I'm having a hard time getting buy-in to converting. And it's also the one that will have the most impact on the headspace in the unit.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a dynamic you have to think about.
Marty, could you say more on why you're having, what's the resistance that you're running into? Tenants, property managers?
Well, it's primarily right now, it's property management. And the reason is that we have technically maybe just enough headspace to be able to convert from full-size gas stove and oven to a full-size electric stove and oven. But that would be it. We'd be maxed out at that point. I don't ever want to get there. So we're looking at, well, what could we do as alternatives to that? Putting in a convection microwave and, a glass top cooking, system and something that will use less electrical. And we're getting well, why don't we just not do the the gas stoves. Let's leave the gas stoves in. And it's like, well, then we're not all electric. We have not actually, met the goal. So, and it seems silly to continue to have gas just for gas stoves. So that's the battle I'm fighting right now, beyond the cost of just doing a project like this.
That's really helpful.
Bobby had his hand up earlier on. Did you still have a question, Bobby?
Yeah, it was kind of going, my headset might die. I just got the dying sound. But the question I had was sort of related to that cooking gas question. And curious if the report will have a breakdown of like proportion or percentage of the buildings that will be impacted by this policy, which ones have gas, heat, and hot water, which ones work in cooking gas, and sort of the breakdown of where the gas is or where the emissions are coming from. Because in our portfolios, we have almost exclusively gas for hot water heating only. So the prescriptive sort of pathway makes a lot of sense for SHA for those properties. So that's just sort of a general curiosity there. I do have another question, but want to hear just if that's something that's going to be in the report.
Not to a level of detail, because I mean the report's really focused on this group of buildings. We've done some analysis of the benchmark data and the OH, and this is where bringing those two together is helpful. I mean, there are various ways to unpack the data in terms of identifying where buildings just have gas for domestic hot water and where the load obviously is spread elsewhere. But it's not precise. It's based on regression analysis rather than anything else.
Okay. And the sort of pathway to exemption thing makes me think about like in some of the earlier discussions we were having, and certainly in other discussions that I am involved in outside of this group, when we talk about electrification, we talk a lot about co-benefits and sort of like the justice impacts or potential for environmental justice or advancing environmental justice measures in a building. And I guess bristle a little bit at thinking that like electric buildings are completely exempt just by virtue of being electric. I think that leaves a lot on the table from an efficiency standpoint, and also leaves a lot of people out. And I know the intention is to keep us from having to spend money and make investments in things that are expensive. But I also think that it ultimately leaves those folks behind from realizing benefits that would be realized if it was an actual performance-based standard. So just wanted to kind of throw that out there, and maybe I've been out of the loop and we've talked about that already, and why we are not doing any sort of performance-based or UI target outside of the state standard. But is there a reason why we're not being more aggressive in Seattle than the state standard from an EUI perspective, other than cost? Or is that the primary driver of why we're not looking at that or thinking about it?
I'll answer that. I mean, the primary reason that the city isn't pursuing energy standards is because it would overlap with what the state is doing. And especially now that they are including, or intend to include, I should say, or I guess they are including the tier 2 buildings, which includes multifamily. So it's really based on a lot of feedback that we've heard from building owners of all kinds about not wanting layers and layers of regulation. And so the decision had been to not do an energy standard in Seattle because there is an energy standard at the state level. And so that's at least, that's the perspective we had been coming from. And I'll just, I mean, for everybody's notice, we are, we're in the phase where we're working on draft legislation. There will be, the likely timing is at council in January, February. Absolutely, we'll have another draft of the legislation that we can share and review, and then there's always time for public comment. This legislation will go out for SEPA. And then, opportunities at council to comment. And, I know, Bobby, you're not alone. And certainly this desire for the city to go farther than the state in terms of what's expected on an energy performance basis. I'm curious from others what, their thoughts. And I'll say, just as we were talking too, I was having this thought about the health benefits, and Marty talking about getting rid of the gas cooking. I mean, in reality, the health benefits of getting rid of a gas boiler in the basement, except for the explosion risk of a gas line, are de minimis, right? In terms of individual health, it's the gas in units where the health impacts are. And so that leads you to gas cooking. And so that's a place where I'm also kind of curious if it's not as much of an emissions reduction, certainly, but is that a prescriptive option?
All right, well, we are about 7 minutes out to the end of the hour here. Just reviewing through notes and things that were inside the chat. Is there a question anyone put in the chat that they feel was not answered?
Yes. When do you think the report will be available?
I think that was answered as mid-October.
Mid-October, yeah.
Sorry if I missed that.
No worries. But Jennifer, you had a question much further along there, right after the task force kind of possible recommendation implication slide. You had asked, you wanted to confirm the cost estimates do not include the cost of substantial alterations.
That is correct. Yeah, they're very specific to the retrofit.
Okay, thank you.
And yes, nothing to do with increasing headspace. So, if electrical infrastructure is a barrier, there's obviously nothing in that cost associated with that either.
Hey, Sandra, can you just remind us? So we have the two standards being developed by the state and the city. And so for multifamily buildings in the city of Seattle, they're going to have to comply with both? Or is it an either or?
It's a both, and that's true for all building types, is that they comply with the energy standard through the state and then the greenhouse gas intensity standard through the city, which is, I think we all recognize that that's not ideal. We are, so to the extent that and they're two different metrics, right? We are, coordinating with the state as much as possible on how we might, for instance, model our template after their, like sort of reporting templates, things like that. Just an aside, there's some, through the Infrastructure Act, there's some federal money around code. So, that we're talking to the state about how would we, especially for multifamily and smaller commercial, where those buildings aren't yet required to comply by the state, could we look at what that combined option might be?
Yeah. Bobby, I don't know that all owners in Seattle share the goal for Seattle to be more aggressive. I just think most owners want the simplest option, that like the simplest, most straightforward option. You know, kind of back to that, like having a menu of choices of saying, you know, how are you heating your building? How are you heating your water? And then, you know, what are your windows? All the big things we've already talked about. And then, you know, how can you identify strategies for those big components? But to the extent Seattle can be or feel like it's going to hit a better standard slightly than the state, is there an opportunity for an affordable project in Seattle to only be compliant to the city and be exempt from the state? This is going to be a huge effort to even meet one of these standards, and the consultants and the teams that are going to need to come into play on this effort. I mean, Marty weigh in, Bobby weigh in, but I don't know. You tell me. I mean, Alistair, you may have an opinion too, but it could be while you're doing one, maybe you can check the other. But I think the simplest compliance path is going to be the most preferred. And then, like, you know, yeah, putting that out there. I don't know how your conversations with the state have gone on that front. I mean, obviously, the asset management teams are used to dealing with multiple jurisdictions on a lot of their projects for regulatory compliance, but this is a bit different, you know, involving these somewhat complex scopes of work that could like stuff.
Yeah, so that's, I guess, sort of where I'm coming from, Becky. It's not necessarily that I want us to be more aggressive just for the sake of being more aggressive, but we just wrapped up a study at South Park Manor in South Park that's an all-electric building with UW Integrated Design Lab. And the scope of work to meet the state energy performance target for that building, I don't know that that building necessarily falls within the group that has to be compliant with it, but the scope of work is pretty significant. It's like an envelope upgrade. It's putting in ERV heat pumps in every single unit, converting to heat pump hot water heaters, or increasing the R value in the walls, and it's or both. And it's a significant like scope of work, and so it's, I guess, if we're going to get credit for it in one place, I'd love to get credit for it in two places and not just like in one, and have access to potentially resources from more places to do that type of work. Because I think for us, we're trying to similarly like follow some of the state's lead around environmental justice, and what does it mean for us to be considering health data in our capital plan. And the reality of that is that it's significant. The difference between doing like what we're planning to do and what we would do if we were focused on health and health outcomes is like drastically different. And so that scales all the way down to single family homes, duplexes, and townhomes at High Point and New Holly and Rainier Vista that are primarily natural gas heated and hot for both heat and hot water. And so all of that just kind of is a swirl, and I would like for the swirl to be swirling in the same direction as much as possible. So that's, I am coming from a perspective of like, is there a way for us to meet both or do both and get credit for both, especially when there's no gas present? Because to me, that's like I would love to be able to partner with OSC, Office of Housing, and City Light more, in particular on those all electric buildings that we already have, to make them super efficient. And we do that already with Office of Housing, but like the scale to do that like portfolio wide and the amount of planning and coordination that we would all have to do together is just like huge. Yep. And I hear Jen like, yes.
Oh, sorry, I am on mute. Sorry, I thought I was on mute, but yes, I agree with everything you're saying, Bobby.
Yeah, and I think that like that is a thing that I realize we're here to talk about this specific policy, and I'm happy that we're doing that. And I also think there's like, if it's not this policy, what's the policy that's coming next to better coordinate between all of us? Because, you know, we want to do the right thing, and you know, we get a lot of funds from Office of Housing to do the right thing. And it's the primary barrier for why we're not doing the right thing more often is because we don't have like those pathways to get that money and do it. So that's sort of where I'm coming from when I'm asking why not an EOI standard. It's not necessarily that I am an activist. I don't know what the word is. A crazy person. Crazy is not the right word. Passionate person. So.
Well,
But thank you,
so
Becky, because thanks for underlining that.
Well,
Thank you
Bobby,
so much.
passion is what really drives change, and we truly appreciate that. And I think you make a critical point that this task force strategy team should look at. I was presenting yesterday to the House Environmental and Energy Committee, and they had questions of how to support the sector. And I think those are germane points to raise for the state as well. But I do know that Bambi is about to kick us off here.
Yep. Thank you all so much for showing up. And yes, you will see an invite in your inbox, I am sure, for another conversation. I hope you are flexible and amenable to that. You know, this is continuing on, but you know, it's important work and we really need to come to some kind of semblance of conclusions that can affect our recommendations. So we want to make sure we have the information and we create the space for that interaction.
Thank you all.
Great. Thanks,
Yeah.
everybody.